Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today for Sharepoint and Revit. So Sharepoint is a part of the Office 365 platform. And today's webinar, we're just going to have a bit of a look at how we can use Sharepoint to enable us to in the work from home situation. All right, so a little bit about myself. My name's Kent Watson. I've been working with A2K for nearly 15 years. And I've been working with AutoCAD and Revit for quite a while. A little bit about A2K. Basically, we love dealing with people in the infrastructure, building, mining, construction, manufacturing industries. And we do a lot of education around the software, but more than software, workflows, etc., which comes into our consulting. We also provide IT management. A2K, once again, loves working with visionaries to help shape the future of our design and provide innovative workflows that minimise risk and improve productivity. As I mentioned, Office 365 is in, well, I guess Sharepoint, perhaps more specifically, is included with Office 365 enterprise plans and some business plans. So you'll need to check your plan to make sure that you have Sharepoint, which is actually different to OneDrive. It still uses the OneDrive engine, but for those of you that only have OneDrive included in your Office 365 plans, you'll probably be able to take something away from this, but it is specifically about the Sharepoint workflows. So Sharepoint provides some good collaboration features, and we're going to have a look at how we can take advantage of those features to help us work from home. Before I move on, it would be our recommendation, of course, to use BIM 360 with Revit. But, you know, for some offices, perhaps don't have the BIM 360 tools and perhaps do not need the BIM 360 tools. And that's where working with Sharepoint is going to be a great alternative. So the kind of files that we need to manage for Revit will obviously be our family files. There'll be shared parameters and keynotes, which are text files. We'll have our template files, whether it's a project template or a family template. There's material libraries and images that the material libraries use. And of course, there are our project files. Just a little side note here, the Sharepoint workflow that we're going to look at does not work for if you're going to use work sets. Okay, so this really only applies to people that are going to open a Revit project file and work within that project file. So don't try any of what we're looking at here with work sets. You can perhaps use a federated model, so use a lot of file links if you need multiple people to work on the same file if you want to use Sharepoint, but once again, BIM 360 really is the platform if you're going to need to use work sets. As I said, there are a lot of people though that will work on a project and don't need work sets on that particular project, and so this is going to be a great solution for those people. So methods in Sharepoint, the methods we have to access files, like any web-based file sharing service, there is the download from browser option. Of course, we do have the ability to sync folders, and when we do sync folders, it doesn't actually automatically download everything It does leave the files on the cloud and downloads them as needed, but there are also ways around that, which we'll look at. There's also probably a little known method called WebDAV, which is where we can map a network drive to our cloud drive. And there's a sort of an image here that we can see where I've mapped network drive to the share file folder. All right, so the Sharepoint download from browser, the advantages we get using the download from browser over those other methods is we have the ability to check out files. And what that means is when we check out a file, nobody else will be able to work on that file. So it stops us sort of tripping over each other and potentially duplicating work. When a file is checked out in the browser, we do get a little icon in the browser there that shows that the file is checked out. We can then check the file back in and we can add comments, which we can see down here. Comments have been added. And as we check the file back in, we also get versioning as well. So here we can see some various versions, different people that have uploaded those versions, comments made, and we can actually revert back to those we can actually directly download some of those older versions or revert back to some of those older versions if needed, which is pretty handy in some instances. So what it's good for is working on project files and making sure only one person works on a file at a time. The next method is to use the folder sync. Now, what I'll say at this point is if you're only having one person, particularly, say you're doing residential buildings and you just got one person working on a building at a time, then the folder sync may be the best method for you. If you're going to have multiple people trying to potentially access the file at the same time, then the folder sync will apply in certain scenarios, but which we can see over here. But you'll want to use the download from browser method, which we'll look at that workflow a bit later. So the advantages with the folder sync is that there's no need to go to a web browser to download the file, or once again to go to that web browser and upload the file. And there is this option to force the sync, which is this option here, always keep on this device. It means there'll always be a copy. So even if you don't have an internet connection for whatever reason, you'll still be able to access it. So what it's good for, I'll go on to the disadvantages in a sec, but what it's good for is, getting our family library from the office onto our local computer, getting our templates, shared parameters and keynotes and materials. The disadvantages with the folder sync is you can end up having two people work on the same file at the same time. And you can see here's an example of where two people have worked on the one file at the same time, made some changes and then saved it. So this file here, that was the original file, and then the conflicting file was actually added with the name of the workstation appended to the end of the file name. And then these other two sort of disadvantages that sort of work together, the file locking. So when we actually check a file out through the method here of the download from browser, when we check that file out, in our Windows Explorer, we do get a little lock icon, and you can see the lock icon showing up over here as well. That's in the browser that we're looking at there, and that's from Windows Explorer. And what you'll notice is when a file is saved, the backup file, which in Revit, it's that .0006 in that situation there, the backup file, and for AutoCAD, it's the .back file. Actually, the lock is carried to the backup files and it's not held on the actual working project file that we want to use. So that's a bit of an issue if we're trying to work through the synced folders. All right, so the WebDAV, once again, I guess the advantage is that you're working with the files directly on the cloud, and it reduces the required storage space on the device. And this can be good for families, templates, shared parameters, and keynotes. I would not use it for materials though, because every time you wanted to do a render or look at a view that contained, materials to render the view, then it would be pretty slow trying to pull those images over the internet. So once again, we have some disadvantages around the file locking, and which can cause the ability to have more than one person working on the same file accidentally. And some of the older forums suggest it is unstable. I personally haven't seen any real issues with the new version of SharePoint, but that's not to say it's been fully and thoroughly tested. SharePoint and Revit recommended workflow is that we would use the folder sync to sync our families, our templates, any shared parameters and keynotes, materials, and our linked project files. And then we would use our browser download option to download the project files and check them in and out, etc. Now, as I said before, if you are just say doing houses and you only got one person ever working on that file at the same time, you could potentially do your project files in this method as well with the folder sync. But we're going to look at this particular workflow here for the rest of this webinar. So the setup in SharePoint is you need to create a Revit management group, and you would be able to do that either through Microsoft Outlook or Microsoft Teams or in SharePoint itself. And you want to go to the groups documents, create a folder structure that replicates your current server. And this can be done by simply uploading the folders from your server to SharePoint. So you can see here we have that option there, and there's just a fairly simple example perhaps of what you might have on your server that's been uploaded to SharePoint. Now this is where I think we need to be careful on our local computer. For the folder sync, you'll notice down here the default path when you want to do a sync with your, do the folder sync with SharePoint is it's going to send it to the user profile. And that's going to cause issues with finding links, etc. So what I would suggest instead is that you create a folder on your C drive. You can call it C, _SP for SharePoint. Call it whatever you like. I would suggest to try and keep it fairly short so we don't potentially run into issues with the length of paths to the actual file. Then when setting up the sync folders, of course, for the first time, you'll be asked to map that folder. And this is where you want to go to this manual option here to change the location. And you're going to point the location to the folder that you've created. If you've previously done a folder sync, then it will automatically be going to this location and you won't be asked to map your folder as shown in that screen capture there. So instead, what you would need to do is you'd actually need to go and unlink into the settings and unlink the computer and then go through the sync process again. And as you go through that sync process again, you would then change the location. And as I mentioned before, for at least the materials folder, I'd ensure you force the sync. As I said, it can take a long time to render views if the material folders are found, or it's trying to pull the data across the server from particularly from the cloud. Then likewise for the browser download part of the workflow, I'd once again create a folder where you're going to save all your projects that you'll be downloading. So to set up Revit, then obviously what we're going to do is we're going to go into our particular folder locations, and we are going to map all our folders to, or the file locations to the folders on our local computer that we've set the sync up with. So if we've done that properly with this folder path that we've set up, then you would actually be able to grab your Revit ini file and share that with other users, because all the locations would actually be pointing to the same location. So the Revit project work, the way that we're actually going to work on this, and I've written that descriptively here. We'll have a look at it later from a sort of a flow diagram, but basically we're going to check out our files that we want to work on. We'll download those files to our pre-set up folder that we just talked about. Obviously we'll work on the file, save it as needed, and upload the project file to SharePoint, overwriting that file that already exists on SharePoint, and that's how the versioning will be created. And when we're finished working on that file, it is then fairly essential that you check that file in, because if somebody else needs to be able to work on it, they won't be able to work on it until you've checked the file back in. That's the whole purpose of the checkout and the check-in. All right, the linked files that are going to be living in our synced folders, we can relink out those files to our project using an absolute path. And that way, that would ensure that regardless of where our project file is stored on our computer, that the path to the link file is the same, and that'll be the same for everybody that has the same setup. Big note here, never open your project files you're going to work on from the synced folders, because of the issues that we talked about previously. So to look at that graphically, I suppose we've got all our files stored in SharePoint. We're going to check out and download our files onto our computer, work on them, etc., and upload and check in. We'll do a folder sync between SharePoint and our local computer, and we'll have the folders synced. We can force the sync if we need to. And then in our project file, any files that are linked will be in here as well, and they'll be pulled across and linked into our project file. Of course, if we use this setup and you are lucky enough to be working with Avail, then we'll be able to map all those files in Avail, and everybody in that channel, because the path to those files is consistent for everybody, then everybody would be able to use Avail as well. All right, so that sort of covers our SharePoint side of things. As I mentioned at the beginning, BIM 360 really is the ultimate workflow. If you're lucky enough to have that, then you can use that. And we do have some webinar coming up tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Contact your account manager or get in touch with us in regards to that. And I hope you've all been able to gain some information that's going to be useful and make life a bit easier for you during this time. And, you know, if you've got any questions or need any help or assistance in setting up any of what we've talked about there for your people that need to be working from home, then please get in contact with us, and we'll be more than happy to assist you in that way. So thank you for your time today, everyone. Stay safe and wash your hands regularly. Thanks. Bye.